I hope everybody's doing well. This is the next video we're going to be talking about. It's going to be Unit 8 covering ecology. I miss everybody and I'm glad you guys have been checking out Teams and all the virtual stuff I've been putting on. But let's go ahead and get down to business. Now, before we really dive into ecology, we really should review what are the 6 kingdoms of organisms. First, you have archaea, which is going to be a prokaryote. Those are basically any kind of bacteria, germs, all that kind of stuff. Eubacteria, which is a prokaryote too, are things that you see in like extreme environments like black smoker vents or hot springs or anything like that. Protista are these little bitty kind of a little bit bigger than prokaryotes, but they are basically this single-celled organism that have a bunch of different organelles and swim around things like ponds and all that stuff. Fungi, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with, is a eukaryote, and that is any kind of organism that doesn't use photosynthesis and it decomposes stuff. Plants or plantae, also a eukaryote, do not decompose stuff. They use photosynthesis instead to get their energy, making using sunlight to make sugars and glucose. And animalia, which is also a eukaryote, I'm sure you guys are familiar with, any kind of animal at all. And remember, prokaryotes are things that do not have a nucleus, no nucleus. All these other guys, eukaryotes, they are anything that do have a nucleus or organelles too. Now, we've already talked a little bit about cells all the way up to organisms right here on the little GIF that I have. But this next unit about ecology is going to be talking about all the way up to the biomes. And you can kind of see everything listed right here in these little circles. And we're going to be going through everything from population up to biome. But just a real quick refresher, we're going to be going through each one of them individually and talking about them. Now, the first thing is going to be the cell. And you can't see it because of my picture, but it's right here on the bottom bit. And it is the smallest unit of living things. Next group is going to be tissues. They are a group of cells that are working together, as you can see in this picture right here. Next, you have the heart, which is a organ, and those are just a bunch of tissues working together. And remember, there are different kinds of tissues, okay? Muscle tissue, connective tissue, all that kind of stuff. Next up, we have the organ system. And that is basically like any kind of group of organs that are working together. This is the cardiovascular system right here and the skeletal system. And they are just a bunch of organs that are all working together. Next is going to be an organism. So any kind of individual living thing, like this lion right here. Next up you have, and this is the new stuff, is a population. So a population is just all the same kind of species living in a particular area. Okay, so you can't say the population of lions in Africa is the same in all of Africa because there's different areas of Africa that lions live in. Now, in a specific area, a community is all the populations in an ecosystem. So if we're going to keep up with this kind of savanna Africa scenario that we're talking about, a population would be the lions and the zebras and all the other organisms that are in that ecosystem. An ecosystem is all the non-living, all the living stuff inside of this particular area and how they interact. So when we're talking about ecosystem, we're talking about the zebras, we're talking about the lions, we're talking about the grass, the tree, the rain, the wind, dirt, everything. Okay, that is an ecosystem. Next up, we have a biome, and that is a really large, essentially like a super ecosystem that stretches a really large area. Like in this case, we're talking about African grasslands that lions live, and that's this whole super ecosystem, which is called a biome. And there's different populations of lions that are going to be living in this ecosystem and different small little ecosystems all connected into one big biome. Now, this is a nice little chart that kind of explains everything for all the new stuff in this levels of organizations that we've learned. And remember, all you have still have cells and tissue and organ systems all within organism, but we're not showing that. Instead, we're just talking about an individual organism, the species, a bunch of closely related organisms. The population is a bunch of different organisms all forming together a group in the kind of close area. The community, which is all the critters, even if they're different species within a certain area. And that ecosystem is the certain area we've been talking about, and that's everything, not just the community, but are talking about grass and wind and everything that has to do within that area. Now, we've kind of gone into a little bit about populations and communities and all that, but we will be touching on those later throughout these slides. I really want to address biomes right now because that might be a hard thing to understand, but they're just major regional, like a global community of not just living stuff, but non-living things. Think of it like a super ecosystem. You have all these different kind of biomes here, and you can see this wheel, and scientists don't even agree on all the names. If you look up biomes in the on Wikipedia, you get a really long list, a lot longer than this. But you can generally define them by the temperature, how much rainfall they get, and oddly enough, what kind of plants they have. Plants in a desert are going to be a lot different than plants in a jungle, but then again, so is the temperature and so is the precipitation. Just remember, biomes contain a bunch of different kinds of ecosystems. If you look at a jungle, you're going to have streams and ponds and rivers along with kind of a jungle ecosystem too, and cave ecosystems, all these different ecosystems within one biome. Now, what kind of level of organization is Simba here in this picture? He is a organism. And you can see that right here. He's made up of organ systems, which is made up of organs, which is made up of cells. Next up, we have this picture. So what level of organization are all these critters that are assembling at Pride Rock in the Lion King? Well, they are going to be a population, a community, because they're different animals. You have elephants, giraffes, zebras, and they're all different populations of animals together as a community. Now, next up, we have Simba being taken care of by his mom. What would that be? That would be two organisms together, which would be a population of lions in this case. Now, before we dive too deep, we need to understand what ecology is. Ecology can be broken up into two words, eco, which means home, and ology, which is the study of. So this is the study of the home of organisms, basically how organisms and the environment kind of interact within the ecosystem. And when we're talking about the environment, we're talking about non-living things. We're going to talk about abiotic in a minute, but that just means any kind of non-living thing. So the environment is like the dust in the air or the water on the ground or the sunlight. All that is the environment, things that are not living around you. The ecosystem, though, is everything, not just the rain and the dust and the abiotic non-living stuff, but the biotic and living stuff that lives within the ecosystem. Now, we've been talking about biotic and abiotic, but let's go ahead and define those. Abiotic, and you can understand this by breaking up the word too, means any non-living things. This a prefix, it means without or not, and you're going to see that a lot in science. If you remember analogous structures, that a means not or without. So it's any non-living thing that is part of the ecosystem. Biotic factors, bio means life. You have stuff like biofuel is fuel that comes from life. And it is any kind of living parts within the ecosystem. So in these pictures here, this rain is going to be a non-living abiotic factor, where the bee and the flowers and everything else you see in this picture that's alive is going to be the biotic factors. Now, biotic and abiotic factors, they're going to talk about basically, in this case for biotic factors, we're talking about how organisms interact. Things like how the plants and the animals and all the other critters in an organism interact with each other. When abiotic factors and the non-living things, we're talking about how do all the non-living stuff interact with each other. The air, water, soil, wind, sunlight, energy, all that. And those things kind of influence where an organism survives. A camel is only going to be able to survive in the desert, and he probably won't do that well in the jungle, right? Because they're adapted for these certain abiotic factors. Now, biotic and abiotic, remember living and non-living things, can actually change ecosystems majorly because ecosystems don't really have these clear-cut boundaries like countries have. There's no line saying that one ecosystem stops here and another one stops here. Because if we're talking about like how they can change biotic factors, you can change from things like migration of birds or a population of animals or seed dispersal, seeds carried by the wind or something like that. And it causes the environment to kind of grow or shrink depending on what happens with these animals and what they're doing. Abiotic factors can change the ecosystem too, and actually even more. Things like floods, erosion, and drought can cause an entire ecosystem to change from one to the other, or maybe shrink and change the boundaries of the ecosystem itself. Now, when we're talking about where a population lives, there's two things that really determine where an organism, a population of organisms, can live. Firstly is the habitat. And it's basically where that organism likes to live. Beavers have a habitat of dams that they build out of wood and on rivers. So they're going to like to live in a forest area next to some kind of water. Okay, the habitat is where an organism lives, where it finds food and shelter. A niche is the role that the organism plays. So if we're still talking about beavers, basically what beavers do is they help control streams, and that's how the organism finds food and shelter. The beaver's niche is to chew dead and rotten uh, trees and build dams, which provides kind of shelter for fish and all that kind of stuff. In this picture, you have a habitat, which is basically ecosystems or biomes where they all like to live. And the niche, in this case of the bee, is to pollinate flowers. It's finding food from the nectar of the flowers, and its role is to kind of spread that pollen between flowers and pollinate other flowers. Now, this little graphic here is a nice way of showing exactly what we're talking about. Environment is everything around an organism. Air, plants, earth, water, wind, all that kind of stuff. And inside the environment, you have a habitat. And that's basically where an organism likes to live. In a jungle, monkeys might like to live in the trees. So that's the area of the environment where that organism grows, survives, and gets food and shelter. A niche is that organism's role inside the environment and its habitat. So when we're talking about bees, the niche is for pollination of flowers, but they live within a habitat or an environment that might be different from area to area, but they still have the same niche because bees pollinate flowers. Now, in this case, what is the wolf's habitat? Well, you can kind of see it right now. It's snowy and there's trees. So their habitat's probably going to be some kind of forest or tundra, any kind of place where there's cold and there's woods. Now, what is the wolf's niche? That's a little bit of a harder question to answer, but wolves, they actually control the population of herbivores like deer or any other kind of prey that they eat. Otherwise, they might get out of control. Now that's all for Unit 8.1, but we're going to be talking about all of Unit 8 in this slideshow. I put these in here just so they can kind of break it up for you. That way you don't get all overwhelmed with all the units of 8.1 and you can do it at your own pace. Now, this unit 8.2, we're going to be talking about producers and consumers. Producers are anything that makes their own energy. And the most common example of a producer is plants because they make their own energy through photosynthesis, taking in sunlight and making their own energy and turning it into glucose or sugar. Consumers are anything that eat other organisms for energy. So these cows right here, you may not think it, but they are a consumer because consume means to eat. So anything that eats others for energy is going to be a consumer. Now, we talked a little bit about this at the beginning of the year, and we were going to go in more depth in Unit 9, but we're going to kind of address it right now. Since organisms get their energy from the environment, so sunlight or other animals or any kind of abiotic or biotic things around them, okay, some of that energy is saved for later and they store it within them. Animals use fat and they make lipids. You kind of remember lipids from the beginning of the year, okay? Plants use sugar, which is glucose, and that's what they store. So that's why plants have that kind of sugary taste sometimes, is because that is the glucose in them. And then animals store their energy in these molecules called lipids. But not all the energy is stored. A lot of it is going to be used just to keep them alive, like keep them breathing and moving and keeping their body temperature, when we're talking about animals, kind of up. Now, this is the big thing we're going to be talking about in Unit 8.2. The energy flows through a food chain. And a food chain is basically the path of energy from producers, like this plant, to consumers in the environment. So this plant right here is making its own energy because it's a producer and is eaten by other consumers over here. So the consumer of the grasshopper is going to be eating the plant and the energy flows to the grasshopper. And that grasshopper is eaten by a bird, and that energy from the grasshopper is given to the bird, and so on and so on. And these arrows, it's really important that is the transfer of energy from one organism to other as they're being eaten. So in this GIF right here, you have the mouse, and that mouse has eaten an apple and got its energy from the apple. But the owl eats the mouse, which is how the owl gets its energy. So really, in a roundabout way, the owl is getting its energy from the apple. But nature is a lot more complicated than just a simple food chain, going from plant to grasshopper to bird to snake, right? There's a lot of different organisms and critters in an environment, and that makes the food chain more like a food web, okay? You have a food web right here where you have all the organisms and how they kind of interact and eat and give energy to one another. In the food chain, it's only one kind of set of arrows where you're just talking about plants to deer to lion to death back to plants, right? The food web is a bunch of different food chains that are all together, and it talks about the entire environment as a whole. So, just to clarify things, food chains is just one path of energy, okay? Food web is all the passive energy that are within an ecosystem. Basically, how all of them interact with each other. And we're not just talking about one straight line of things, but we're talking about all the organisms in an environment. And you can probably imagine that a food web with all the possible energy paths can get pretty complicated. Now, we kind of talked about this at the beginning of Unit 8.2, but let's really kind of dive into exactly what producers and consumers and decomposers are. Producers make their own energy. They use photosynthesis, and there's other ways to do it too, but they're less common, but mainly photosynthesis, and they're any kind of plant or algae or anything that just makes their own energy. And these producers are eaten by consumers. And consumers are anything that just eats other organisms. So in this case, these cows right here are consumers. They eat the plants and and anything else that they normally would eat to get their own energy. These birds in the background, they're consumers too. They eat insects and other kind of things, and they are eating eating other organisms and to get their own energy. They cannot make their own energy. Now, decomposers break down matter. So when a consumer or a plant dies, you're going to have decomposers, which basically break them down and return all their energy back to the soil. Decomposers are things like funguses or some kind of bacteria that break down things and return them back to the soil. So you have this kind of, back to Lion King, you have this whole circle of life where producers are making energy, consumers are eating it, and decomposers are returning it back into the system. Now, producers are going to be anything that convert their own energy into food. I'm sure you're tired of hearing me say this, but they are autotrophs. And we kind of learned about this at the beginning of the year. Autotrophs are automatically making their own food from sunlight and turning it into glucose or energy for that organism. Most producers use sunlight in a process called photosynthesis, and they turn that sunlight into energy, and that's stored as glucose or sugar. And that's kind of chemical energy that they can break down and use later. All green plants, all of them are producers. They all make their own energy through photosynthesis. Now, decomposers, they are going to be breaking down matter. Decomposers are basically nature's recyclers. They take old dead things or even living things, they break them down and return the energy and the nutrients in them back to the environment. So decomposers can be funguses or bacteria or earthworms or even kind of mold. And you can see this kind of gift right here of a decomposing pineapple. All these things are breaking down uh, uh, the energy within an organism, like pineapple, and returning it back to the environment. Earthworms break down old leaves and all that kind of stuff, and they return the energy from those dead leaves back into the soil, which is what producers use for nutrients to help them grow. So all these things are decomposers, and they help move the matter and move the nutrients and energy through an ecosystem. If we didn't have them, then stuff would just be piling up and nothing would ever return back to the soil. We would have just a bunch of dead trees and all that kind of stuff just building up. Now, consumers, they eat other organisms. Remember, consume means to eat. So anything that eats another organism, that's talking about cows, everything from cows to lions, okay? They eat other organisms and they use the energy and the nutrients stored within the other organisms because they can't really make their own food. And because they can't make their own food, they're being called a heterotroph. And we kind of learned about this too at the beginning of the year between autotroph and heterotroph. But hetero means different. So they are consuming different things to get their own nutrients and energy to help them live because they can't make their own. And there's a bunch of different kinds of consumers. You have herbivores, where they eat only plants. You have carnivores, that eat only animals. Omnivores eat plants and animals. And scavengers are specialized and they only eat dead things. Now, herbivore can be broken up into herb, which is plant. So you know that herb is plant and herbivores eat plants. Carny means meat. So anything that eats meat is a carnivore. Omni means all. So anything that you eat plants and animals, you are an omnivore because you're eating all of it. Scavenger is scavenger. You can't really pick that up. Now, this we're sidetracking a little bit, but I really think this is kind of cool and that you guys should. Now, this is a bunch of different herbivores, and you can kind of tell they're herbivores just by looking at the teeth. Because herbivore means plant eater, so herb is plant. And it's this elephant right here. If you're looking at the elephant, these are his teeth right now. They have really flat teeth because all they're meant to do is grinding up plant life. That's one elephant's tooth right here, and you can tell it looks like a really flat kind of grindstone where it grinds plants. Deer, on this case, they have a little bit more edges to their teeth, but they're still basically flat, and you have this flat area between them. And if you ever see a deer's tooth, a lot of the flat surface of it is meant to grind up these, plants and all kind of stuff that they eat. Carnivores, because carne means meat, vor is eater of, so they are eaters of meat. In this case, you have a coyote right here. And if you look at a coyote skull, he has all these different serrated teeth. And these teeth are not meant to be grinded soft. They're not flat. They're meant to kind of tear through meat and kind of break up, think like serrated knife blades. A lot of the reason that animals like this coyote or even the jaguar have these large kind of front teeth and incisors is to actually aid them. It's an adaptation to help them kill the organisms that they eat for energy. And these back teeth are meant to kind of act like knives where they are able to break up meat easier. Omnivores are anything that eats both plants and animals. And remember, omni means all. So anything that's an omnivore is eating all the kind of stuff, plants and animals. Chimpanzees are a really good example because they have these really big canines you can see kind of right here that are meant for kind of tearing into meat. They also have these back molars that are meant to grind up plants and fruits and all that. If you look at us right here, you see we have kind of the same thing where we have these canines and incisors that are meant to kind of tear into meat. But we also have these back molars, which are meant to grind up plants and stuff that are in between teeth, and that's why we are omnivores. Now, scavengers is a really broad category, and we can't really talk about their teeth because they are specially adapted to eat dead organisms. And it really doesn't have anything to do with the teeth. It's more like biology inside them, inside their organ systems and their organs. They are made to be able to kind of stand and eat the bad, nasty meat that's left over from carnivores after they're done with the kill. So we're talking about things like this vulture or a hyena, specially adapted organs and organ systems to be able to eat this meat. And they are just as important as decomposers because if you didn't have these scavengers, then all the leftovers from like a lion's kill would just be out on the open and it would never actually return into nature. So these scavengers are really important in cycling the energy and cycling the nutrients from an organism that's died back into the environment. It's the whole circle of life. Okay. Now that we've kind of talked about producers, consumers, and decomposers, we organize them into their roles in the food chain. And it's kind of done through a pyramid. On the bottom, you have producers, like this tree, that are going to be at the bottom of the food chain, and they're making all the energy. They give their energy when they're eaten to a primary consumer, something that eats producers, because they're primary, they're the very first consumer in the food chain. And those primary consumers are eaten by something called a secondary consumer, because they're the second consumer in the food chain, and they are the ones eating the primary consumers. In this case, we're talking about a snake eating the primary consumer of a mouse. And finally, you have a tertiary consumer, the very top of the food chain, and tertiary consumers eats other secondary consumers. So in this case, we're talking about an owl or an eagle or something that eats a snake. And then finally, you have decomposers. And decomposers, they kind of recycle all this energy from dead organisms back into the soil and back to the producers because decomposers are nature's recyclers, right? So once again, you have producers. They are the base of the food chain. They're making all the energy from the sunlight and photosynthesis. Then you have a primary consumer who eats producers because they're the first one. They are called primary. Then you have the secondary. They eat the primary consumers. And finally, you have tertiary consumers. And tertiary means three, by the way. So tertiary is the very top of the food chain, and they're the ones that eat the secondary consumers. Now, this kind of little animation will kind of help you out when we're talking about this. You have producers at the base of the food chains, and they make their own energy. Any kind of photosynthesis, they're making their energy. They're doing their own thing. They don't need anybody to help them make their own energy. But they are eaten by primary consumers. Things like grasshoppers and mice and cute little rabbits. They're eating all these vegetables and plants and stuff. They're the ones directly eating all that energy that is made by the producers. And then these primary consumers are eaten by secondary consumers, where you have birds eat grasshoppers, snakes eat mice, and these secondary consumers are eating the primary consumers. And then finally, you have tertiary consumers. Tertiary consumers, and tertiary means three, okay? They eat the secondary consumer. So you have things like these eagles that are eating snakes on the secondary consumer. And that's how kind of energy flows through an ecosystem. And finally, and I cannot stress this important enough, you have decomposers, and they're the ones that kind of recycle matter back into the soil. So these decomposers are all along the whole food chain because they don't care. Instead, they're going to break it down and return it back to producers. That way, the producers get the energy and the nutrients that they need being taken from them by the primary consumer. Now, I know you're not here right now, but still, I'd like you to kind of answer these questions as we go. What is this guy right here? He would be a tertiary consumer because he's eating the secondary consumers. I already said it, but what is this guy right here? Secondary consumer. And what is the mouse right here? Because he's eating plants, he would be called a primary consumer. And finally, the plants at the bottom, what are those? They're going to be the producers. So they're, you can think of them as 0, 1, 2, 3. So all this is kind of going together. The energy is transferred within the ecosystem. The sun is going to give energy to the producers, and those producers are going to give their energy when they're eaten to the herbivores, the primary consumers, and those herbivores are going to give their energy to carnivores, which are secondary consumers, and those carnivores are eaten by top predators, which are the tertiary consumers. Now, this is really important to understand because energy cannot create it or destroy it. It only just takes different forms. It doesn't just go in the air. It always goes into something else. So organisms help this energy kind of move through the ecosystem. And we're talking about here in this example, you have the sun feeding into the producers, which are eaten by the primary, and then the secondary, and then the tertiary consumers at the top. Now, I know I said that energy is never created or destroyed, and this is a really important principle in physics, but it also applies to biology and ecosystems because energy is actually lost as you go up each energy level. And this is kind of a higher level concept we're going to need to cover right now. So don't worry if you don't quite get it. But basically, every time the energy is transferred up this kind of ladder of the food chain, it's a little bit is lost each time because a lot of it is stored as heat in the organism itself. So the heat of the snake right here is being stored as energy of the snake. And when it's eaten by the eagle right here, it doesn't get all the energy from the snake. Some of it's heat, others, a lot of the energy from the snake is in the bones or in other organs that the eagle just can't eat. So the eagle's eating some of the meat, but it can't eat the whole snake. So a lot of that energy is lost. And as you go up each level, more and more and more energy is lost as you go up. Now that's all for Unit 8.2, where we're talking about the food pyramid and food chains, where organisms kind of eat one another and that transfers energy. And then food web is a more kind of complicated where organisms are actually kind of interconnected and they eat each other. And that's more like what an ecosystem actually is. But the most important thing that you need to remember is that energy is kind of uh, transferred as it goes up this food pyramid. Now, we've been talking about organism energy roles in Unit 8.2, and that's talking about producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers, along with decomposers. But in 8.2, we're going to be talking about the relationships between all these different animals, and they can be categorized into these different things: predators and prey, mutualism, communalism, parasitism, and competition. Okay, now these three right here, these mutualism, communalism, and parasitism, are all symbiosis and relationships in symbiosis. And we're going to be talking about that in just a minute. But before we get into all the different relationships between organisms, you got to remember that these are all biotic factors. All these organisms are biotic, and the way they interact with each other is all going to be under the title of a biotic factor and biotic interactions. So all the symbiosis, the predator-prey, the competition, all that is going to be organisms which are biotic interacting with each other. You can have abiotic interacting with each other, but that's just talking about the water and minerals, energy, and it kind of limits what the organisms, how much they can grow is what the abiotic factor is going to do. Now we're going to start this off simple. Predators eat prey, right? So predators are getting their nutrients and energy from prey. And prey is any kind of animal that's eaten by a predator. An animal can be both predator and prey, like the snake, which is a secondary consumer, is both predator and prey. Now, preys and predators all have really interesting adaptations that kind of help them survive. And this little guy right here, he is usually prey, and his adaptation is to roll up into a ball and protect himself. Tigers have other adaptations, and we kind of talked about that in polar bears before we left, but they have all these kind of different adaptations which help them hide and hunt and get the food that they need to survive. Another really interesting adaptation that's seen in a lot of different animals is the difference in vision between predators and prey. Almost always, predators have kind of like binocular vision where they are seeing forward and they are really good at focusing ahead of them. Prey, on the other hand, you look right here, are really good at seeing around them and to the sides of them because they're being hunted all the time, so they need to keep a better eye out. Whereas predators, they're kind of focused in on what they need to do. So if you look at us, we're kind of predators because our eyes are focused forward and we're going in on a target. Whereas you look at deer or horses, their eyes are on the side and they're looking around trying to figure out if anything's coming to get them. Now, it's really, really important to understand how closely connected predator and prey populations are connected. You think about it like this: predators rely on prey for food, right? So if you don't have any prey, then the predators are going to wind up dying and you're not going to have as big of a population. And we're going to talk about this, but it's called a limiting factor. And it's whenever you have some kind of factor that restricts the size of a population. So if there's not much prey, in this case when we're talking about whales, if there's not a lot of krill for them to eat, and that's going to limit the amount of population of whales or predators that are going to be available and that can survive off that population of prey. Same thing with the salmon. If there's not a lot of salmon in the water, then you're not going to have a lot of bears that are going to be able to survive, and you're not going to have a large population. So when one grows or shrinks, the other grows and shrinks. Now, we're going to be diving into the relationships between animals and how they can help or hurt each other in symbiotic relationships. Now, symbiosis or symbiotic is basically a really close long-term relationship between two completely different species. Like in this cow, you have the bacteria in the gut of the cow that's living in the cow, and you have the cow itself. Those are two different species, and it's a long-term close relationship. But there's a bunch of different types of symbiotic relationships. All these different types are here. You have mutualism, communalism, and parasitism. And we're going to talk about each one, but basically in each one, at least one organism is going to benefit. At least one organism will benefit in a symbiotic relationship. Now, in mutualism, they are both mutually benefiting from this relationship. In other words, both of them mutually benefit. So in this example right here, you have a hippo, but the fish actually clean the hippo's teeth. So not only is the hippo getting a nice dentist visit and getting clean teeth, but the fish are getting food too. In this example right here, you've got clownfish. They actually clean the amoeba and they kind of live inside of it for protection. And in return, the amoeba gets cleaned and it gets a little bit of food from the clownfish as they kind of poop and stuff. Now, communalism is when only one organism benefits. Only one is benefiting from the relationship, but the other is basically unharmed, okay? So a good example of communalism would be like a tree frog in this plant. The tree frog is living on the plant, he's laying his eggs here, and he's using it as protection and camouflage, but the plant is really unharmed and he's not bothered by it at all. In this case right here, you got these water buffalo, and the birds, they hang out on the water buffalo's back, and as the water buffalo kind of stomps through the grass and stuff, they will eat the bugs that the water buffalo's kicking up. So the water buffalo is not really bothered at all by them, but these birds are actually benefiting from the relationship, and that is communalism. Now, you guys know I don't like this one, but this one is parasitism, and we've kind of talked about it a little bit. This is where one organism benefits and the other is harmed, okay? The parasite is the thing that benefits, and the host is the organism that is harmed. So last time we were talking about this, I used mistletoe as an example. Mistletoe grows on the tree, and it steals nutrients and stuff on the tree and keeps it for itself. So the tree is actually harmed by mistletoe. In this case, you have over here, you have a lamprey, and they actually feed on fish when they're still alive, and the fish are harmed by that, and they kind of latch on the fish and hurt the fish. So remember, parasite is the one that benefits, the host is the one that's harmed. Now that's basically it for 8.3. We're talking about predator-prey relationships, and then we're talking about symbiosis and all the different kinds of symbiosis. Mutualism, communalism, and then parasitism. Now, we talked a little bit about this before in Unit 8.3, but we're going to really dive into it right now between competition and limiting factors. Now, limiting factors is any kind of factor that restricts the size of a population, like how much food there is or how much water and shelter there is. If you look right here, you have this population size and it keeps on increasing. At some point, it's going to hit this line right here, which is the limiting factor is what figures out where that line is. You only have so much food, so much shelter and water to go around before a population just gets too big for it. Now, competition is also kind of a limiting factor where organisms are going to fight for the same resource. In this picture, you have lions and hyenas. They're fighting over the same resource of food. Now, organism happens between the same species and different species. But what's cool is that a lot of organisms, in this picture right here, you can see that a lot of organisms are specially like adapted to where they can share and they don't have to compete even though they're in the same area. Like flamingos have that really long neck to where they can reach the bottom of kind of a pond area, but these other birds, they're going to be fishing in the kind of shallower areas because that's the way they've adapted. So one more time, limiting factors are really important to understand. They limit how much of an organism, the population of organisms can grow because you only have so much resources to go around. Once you hit that limiting factor, that line, they're not going to be able to grow beyond that because they just don't have enough resources to get bigger. Now, we have a bunch of different examples of limiting factors. They're going to be like the amount of water that you have, the amount of food that you have, temperature, the amount of space that's available, or even the availability of mates. all these things are going to be limiting the size of a population. If you don't have enough food to go around, your population is not going to be able to grow and it's going to be limited. Just like with the availability of mates, if you look at a lot of endangered species, you may not have enough mates for the population to grow, and that's why these endangered species are staying small, because they are limited by the amount and the availability of mates. Now, a really important example of limiting factors, especially for coastal areas like Florida, is going to be algae blooms, if you guys have ever heard of that. So limiting factors limit how much a population can grow. Now, algae in the ocean, and you can see in this kind of picture right here, that's kind of like a bird's eye view of algae. They're normally limited by how much food and sunlight is normally there, but they just love the farm chemicals, right? So any of these chemicals that are running off from the farms into the oceans can actually increase the amount of food that they have available. When that food is increased, the population is going to grow with it, right? So when all this chemical runoff from the farms go into the ocean, since they love that food so much, the population is going to just explode, right? When that happens, it can actually kill a lot of fish. And that what happens is basically because the algae is exploding in population, the sunlight doesn't get to the fish that they need. Like the sunlight isn't able to get to the fish. And the fish feed on things that need sunlight. On top of that, the algae actually uses oxygen. And this is the big thing that kills fish, when the algae is using the oxygen up, and because it's such a giant population, it will actually like take the oxygen out of the water, and that causes the fish to not have enough oxygen to breathe. So then the fish start dying. And that's what's happening with these algae blooms, or you might have seen them as red algae blooms or green algae blooms, and they are just destroying the fish population because whenever they explode, they just suck out all the oxygen from within an area like this. Now, another really important thing when we're talking about limiting factors and we're talking about ecosystems, and specifically, we're going to be talking about Florida's ecosystems, but that is introduced species or invasive species. Now, in Florida, an invasive species is going to be pythons, okay? Now, invasive species, they are not native to the land. These pythons are not native to Florida, and they tend to spread in the ecosystem and cause damage to the ecosystem. In Australia, and I'm sure some of you guys know by now, I used to live there, and rabbits and goats were really big invasive species in Australia, and they're really not good for the environment. And that's the reason is because invasive species, they actually take resources from the native ones. So this actually causes way more competition for resources than the native species are used to. They just can't compete. In Australia, you have all these bunnies running around, and because these bunnies are able to reproduce really quickly, they're able to, they're kind of taking away all the resources that the native populations in Australia normally eat. So when you have all these bunnies in an ecosystem, they take away all the different resources from the native ones, and the native species just can't keep up. Invasive species are usually ones that don't have, when they become a problem, they are usually ones that when there's no natural predators or they reproduce really quickly, they're just generally very bad for the environment, and humans are doing a lot to be able to control them. Now, we're going to be diving kind of into exactly all the different Florida's ecosystems and the limiting factors kind of in each ecosystem. Now, you have three different kinds. You have land ecosystems, you have freshwater ecosystems, and you have marine ecosystems. And each one of these we're going to be talking about in detail and about the limiting factors in each one. Now, the first land ecosystem we're talking about is going to be prairies. Prairies are any kind of grassland that dominate in the kind of a flat or hilly area. And prairies aren't just in Florida too, they're all over the world. But a limiting factor is really actually fire. It's really important because it keeps down tree growth, but it also causes new growth for grasses. Because fire, what it does is it whenever it burns the grasses, decomposers actually return the soil, return the nutrients back into the soil, and it causes kind of new life for the prairies. Herbivores are another thing that can actually limit the plant population. If you have like an invasive species like rabbits, they will eat and eat and eat all the plant life until there's nothing left. But normally, natural herbivores, they might limit the plants, but they don't absolutely destroy it. Now, next we're going to be talking about is forests. Now, forests, the limiting factors are going to be kind of light and space because trees are kind of competing for each other inside of a forest. The smaller trees are going to be competing for light and nutrients along with the bigger trees, and that can limit the plant population. Natural fires are actually a really important thing for forests too. What they do is they actually kind of burn away the smaller plant growth and they cause brand new life to spring up. And this lets the bigger plants, these larger trees, kind of grow back and get and not have as much competition. But it also lets smaller things grow too. Now, populations of deer are also controlled by the limiting factor of predators. So in Florida, we have panthers, and they kind of help limit the deer population. Now, this next thing we're going to be talking about in land ecosystem is going to be beaches. Now, I know you guys don't think beaches are a land ecosystem, but you are walking on them, even though they might be right next to the ocean. Now, a lot of different animals like clams and crabs live under the sand, and the birds actually eat these organisms, and that can actually limit the population of the animals in here. Sea turtles, for example, they are limited by the amount of birds that are actually eating the youngins as they're going into the ocean when after they hatch. Now, another thing that limits populations and beaches is going to be human development. And this can actually decrease the amount of space available for nests for birds or sea turtles. Now, a lot of beaches in Florida are sandy, but that's not the only kind of beaches. I thought it'd be kind of cool to include some of the different ones. Like you have green sandy beaches, and they're going to be made of something called glauconite. And that's just a type of mineral. Next, you have some like shell beaches, and you've seen these in I've seen these in Australia before. And these shell beaches are actually made of shells, right? Broken down shells. You got things like gravel beaches, and those are mostly in like northwestern United States or the some of the northern states on the beaches. They have these gravelly stuff. And then finally, you can actually have black sandy beaches if you have a volcano or kind of volcanic activity nearby where the minerals in the sand are made from black volcanic minerals. Now, the final land ecosystem is we're going to be talking about dunes. Now, dunes are really important for beaches because what happens when the sand kind of builds up along the beaches, these low growing plants that are really, really resistant to salt can grow inside the dunes. And this holds the dunes together and with the roots and keeps the dunes in place. If you don't have these plants growing on the dunes, then the dunes are going to be shifting and moving with the wind and the sand blowing, and that can actually cause damage to the human stuff around them. So these low-lying plants help keep the dunes in place, and they provide a habitat that organisms can live in. Now, big trees can't really live on dunes unless they've been there for a really long time and there's enough support for the roots to go in, but generally they just don't. But dunes are super important for like a nesting area for birds, and it can also be limited by the human development since you kind of take away the land and resources that birds need to be able to live and nest there. Now, we're going to be moving on to freshwater ecosystems, and we're going to be talking about rivers and streams. Rivers and streams have flowing water, and this is different from a pond or a lake, which have standing or still water. But what's important about these freshwater rivers and streams is that they carry the nutrients and that are important to the ecosystems and let them flow through the ecosystem. They also give shelter, and that's actually also a limiting factor for a lot of these areas is shelter from in rocks or in roots of trees and stuff growing along the banks. Manatees are actually an endangered species in Florida, and they live in these rivers and streams. So it's really important to keep these things intact for these manatees. Now, another freshwater ecosystem is going to be lakes and ponds. Lakes and ponds are standing bodies of water. They don't really have much flowing water going through them, although they might have some small currents, right? But you have plants that are going to be floating on top of the water or living in the water itself. And these plants are growing in the kind of the shallow areas where they can get light and air. So what's a limiting factor right here is going to be the amount of light and air and oxygen that will limit the population. And if there's enough oxygen, these ponds and these lakes can actually support a ton of different kinds of fishes. Now, we're going to be talking about freshwater ecosystems, and we're going to be talking about wetlands. Now, the Everglades is probably the most notable ecosystem, the wetland ecosystem in Florida. Pretty famous. So this wetland in the Everglades is an area where land is kind of partially covered for at least part of the year. And water is slowly flowing through this area. So it's only partially has water from some of the year. And all these plants that live in the wetlands here, they help remove the waste pollution from the areas before it goes into the ocean or into the drinking water for humans. So these plants are basically, they're sucking out all the pollutants and waste, and they keep them inside them and take them out of the water. Now, as far as limiting factors, nutrients or low oxygen can actually, and drying up the wetland can actually limit the amount of population of organisms in a wetland. Next, we're going to be talking about marine ecosystems. We're going to start with coral reefs. Now, coral reefs are really interesting. They grow in shallow waters, where it's warm and shallow and clear. Okay, and coral reefs are actually made up of tiny little skeletons of these animals called coral. And you can see right here, this is a new coral growing. Okay, but all this area right here that's around it is actually dead coral from the skeleton. So all the stuff that you're seeing for coral reefs, most of it's actually dead skeleton, and only the newer stuff is growing, as you can see right here. But what actually gives coral its color are these tiny little things called protists, and we talked about that at the very beginning of these slides. This protista, they live inside the coral and actually give it the color. And the protists use the light from the coral, use light from the sunlight and shelter from the coral to produce food, which corals can actually use. This is a really good example of mutualism, where both of them are benefiting from this relationship. Corals getting food from the protists, and the protists are getting protection from the coral. This is actually a protist right here, even though you may not see it because of my face. Now, because corals need light to grow, warm temperatures, and nice sunlight, that's going to actually limit the growth of these protists and coral. Now, you look right here, since reefs are home to thousands of species, it's really important to keep these coral reefs intact. And because they have a lot of thousands of species, it's actually a limiting factor in space. And the most important thing that's actually damaging the corals right now is going to be these high temperatures in the ocean water or just polluted water from the land that's actually limiting the coral population and fish population too. Fish live in coral. And because that's happening, these corals are dying. See in this picture right here, these corals are doing something called bleaching, where the corals are turning white, bleaching, and that's because all the protists inside of them are dying because the water may be polluted or the water has too high of a temperature. Now, the next marine ecosystem we're going to be talking about is going to be estuaries. Estuaries are a lot like wetlands, and in fact, estuaries and wetlands can actually blend together. But an estuary is an area where fresh water mixes with salt water. You usually see these in areas where you might have ocean right here, and then they kind of mix in with the river that's flowing into the ocean. So you have a mix of fresh and salt water. And these are a really important part of the ecosystem because a ton of animals live there. You think birds, turtles, alligators all live in estuaries, and they all lay their eggs there. A lot of them use this estuary as kind of nature's nursery, but a lot of scientists might call it. And because they lay their eggs there, these plants, young fish, and all that are breeding in the estuaries, and then they might go to their natural habitat later on. And these populations are limited not just by nutrients in the water, but also by the salt in the water. Because it's a blend of fresh and salt water, different animals live in different parts of the estuary depending on the salt water. Alligators, for example, they need low levels of salt, so they live more towards the riverside than the ocean side. Now, finally, one of the most important ecosystems in the marine system of Florida is going to be mangrove swamps. Some of you guys might have heard these, but mangrove swamps are very, very important for Florida ecosystems because they're swamp areas that are kind of flooded by tides and they have freshwater runoff. These mangrove swamps can actually be in estuaries or it might be in things like wetland areas. But these different ecosystems are kind of blending together, and there's no clear-cut boundaries we were talking about. But these mangroves, they need nutrients and warm temperatures to survive. So, temperature and nutrients are going to be a limiting factor for mangroves. And the reason that mangroves are so important is because these roots, they shelter small fish from predators. And you can see in this picture right here, in this one mangrove, you have a ton of little bitty fish that are living and thriving inside this mangrove, and they're actually surviving off of that and having a symbiotic relationship. Now, what kind of symbiotic relationship is it? I would say it's mutualism because the fish are getting shelter from the mango grove, and because the fish, whenever they poop and stuff, they're giving nutrients back into the mangrove tree itself. So they're both benefiting from this situation. Now, that's basically it for Unit 8.4 and for the entire unit of 8 when we're talking about ecology and ecosystems. Just remember in 8.4, we were talking about all the different kinds of ecosystems in Florida, and specifically really focusing on the limiting factors in each of these ecosystems. Just remember that as a population increases, at some point it's going to hit a level where it can't increase anymore because there's just not enough food or space or water, something, and that population is going to be capped out right there and it's not going to increase anymore. And that's what a limiting factor does, is it limits